He found a wild bobcat guarding his blind cat. The reason why will make you cry. Montana snow began to fall thick and heavy the moment Mr. Thorne stepped back inside to grab an extra blanket. Leaving Moss, a 10-year-old cat with eyes clouded by age and cream-colored fur, sitting alone on the porch. The old cat sat perfectly still on the weathered boards, his tail wrapped around his paws, waiting for his human to return. A lone wolf, gaunt to the bone from hunger and thirst, burst from the pine thicket like a hunger that had been cornered and compressed. The wolf's ribs showed through matted fur. Saliva dripped from its jaws. Its eyes locked onto Moss with the single-minded focus of a starving predator. Before the jaws of death could reach Moss's cream fur, a dark shape shot down from the porch roof like an arrow. The impact between bobcat and wolf cracked through the air, a sound like two boulders colliding. Bram, the wild bobcat, had leapt down at first only to defend his territory, reacting on pure instinct to the intrusion. His claws raked across the wolf's shoulder. His teeth found purchase on the wolf's neck. The two animals rolled in the snow, a blur of fur and fangs. But when the enemy finally fled, limping and bleeding back into the trees, Bram staggered with a deep wound in his shoulder, blood staining the newly fallen snow. The red spread across the white in growing circles, in the cold mist. Instead of fear, Moss moved forward slowly and pressed his head against Bram's bleeding body. The old cat's clouded eyes could not see clearly, but he could smell the blood, could feel the heat radiating from the bobcat's wound. No bared teeth, no growls. Bram panted and lay still beside the old cat, too exhausted and hurt to move. His breathing came in ragged gasps. Snow kept falling, thick and relentless, covering them both in a thin white layer. Mr. Thorne froze in the doorway, the blanket still in his hands. He had grabbed his rifle on instinct when he heard the fight. Now he lowered the weapon at the unbelievable sight of his elderly house cat pressed against a wild bobcat, offering comfort instead of running for safety. He stood there for a long moment, trying to process what he was seeing. Then he quietly set down the rifle, approached slowly with his hands visible, and carried both of them inside. Bram was heavy, 40 pounds of solid muscle. Moss weighed barely 8 pounds now. Mr. Thorne made 2 trips, first carrying the injured bobcat, then returning for Moss, who refused to leave the spot where Bram had fallen. The first months passed in a silence full of watchfulness. Snow piled higher against the cabin walls through November and into the deep freeze of December. Outside, the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, then 30 below. The wind howled through the pines like a living thing searching for a way inside. Ice formed in thick sheets on the windows, creating patterns like frozen ferns. Inside, the wood stove worked constantly, burning through Mr. Thorne's carefully stacked supply of split logs. The cabin was small, just 3 rooms, and the heat barely reached the corners, but it was warm enough. Bram woke on a soft blanket near the stove, the scent of his own blood mixing with the scent of wood smoke, old fabric worn thin from years of use, and one scent that stood out above all others. It was Moss's scent. Lying not far away on a cushion Mr. Thorne had placed on the floor. There was no threat in it, only a feeling of calm that seemed to fill the space between them. Bram's ears twitched forward, then back, testing the space around him. Every small sound registered, the popping and crackle of burning wood, the whistle of wind under the door, the old man's footsteps in the next room. His yellow eyes opened halfway, watching everything, missing nothing. His wound throbbed with each heartbeat. Mr. Thorne had cleaned it and wrapped it in strips of clean cloth, but it would take weeks to heal properly. For the first time in his wild life, Bram did not want to leave. Something about this place, about the old cat nearby, made him want to stay. Mr. Thorne set down 2 bowls on the floor, moving slowly so as not to startle the bobcat. Raw meat for Bram, chunks of venison from the deer he had shot in October. Pate for Moss, the expensive kind from town that the old cat could still manage to eat with his few remaining teeth. Bram looked at the bowl in silence, then turned away. His instincts told him not to accept food from humans. His tail stayed low against the floor. Uncertain, Moss ate half of his portion, licking his lips with his small pink tongue. then pushed the rest toward Bram with one cream-colored paw and let out a small sound. It was barely more than a breath, a tiny chirp of invitation. Bram looked at Moss for a long moment. The old cat's clouded eyes could not meet his gaze directly, but Moss's face turned toward him. Whiskers pointed forward in a gesture that somehow felt like friendship. Bram lowered his head and ate, not because he was starving, but because he had been invited. The meat was good, fresh, better than anything he had caught in weeks. He ate slowly, his eyes never leaving Moss. A few nights later, Bram developed a fever. The wound had become infected despite Mr. Thorne's care. Bram trembled, breathing fast, his body wrapped in a blanket but still chilled to the bone. His temperature spiked. His paws jerked and twitched as if he were running in his sleep, fleeing from invisible dangers. Sweat dampened his fur, making it stick up in odd directions. His body burned hot to the touch. Moss, though already weak from his own advanced age and failing health, crawled out from his spot near the fire. The old cat moved slowly, his joints stiff, his breathing labored. He tucked himself tight against Bram, curling into a living ball of fur. The old cat's small body pressed close to the bobcat's heaving side. His warmth was modest but steady, a small anchor in the storm of fever. Bram's breathing gradually steadied. The trembling eased as the hours passed. Mr. Thorne watched from his chair, amazed. That night, two unfamiliar breaths became one, rising and falling together in the firelight. On another night, thunder rolled across the Montana sky like drums announcing war. Rain hammered the roof like 1,000 fists pounding wood, so loud it drowned out all other sounds. Lightning split the darkness in jagged white lines that turned night to day for brief, blinding moments. The cabin shook with each boom of thunder. Moss, sensitive to noise, shrank into himself. His ears flattened back against his skull until they nearly disappeared into his cream fur. His cream body pressed flat to the floor, trying to make himself as small as possible. His heart raced. His breathing came in quick, shallow gasps. Suddenly, a low sound came from Bram, not a growl but a chuff, a sound of reassurance. It rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound mother bobcats make to calm their kittens. Moss felt the vibration through his paws, through the floorboards, through the mattress where they both lay, and he calmed down. His muscles loosened one by one. His breathing slowed to match Bram's. The whole house sank back into stillness despite the storm raging outside. Mr. Thorne began to record this journey in his notebook, realizing he was learning how to love from a wild beast. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner each night, a single lamp burning beside him, pen moving across paper in his careful handwriting. He wrote about what he saw, what he could hardly believe even as he witnessed it. His hands were weathered and scarred from a lifetime of ranch work, but they moved gently across the page. There were moments when Moss, frustrated, hissed because his old legs could no longer jump onto his favorite armchair. The seat was only 2 feet high, but it might as well have been a cliff to a cat whose hind legs had grown weak with arthritis. Moss would crouch low, his body coiling as he gathered himself for the jump. His haunches would wiggle as he prepared to spring. Then he would fall back without even trying, his courage failing him at the last second. His hiss came out sharp with anger at his own body, at the betrayal of muscles that no longer obeyed his will. Bram did not help by grabbing and lifting him, did not treat Moss like something broken that needed to be carried. Instead, he quietly lay down beside the chair and became a living step. His muscles tensed, holding steady under Moss's weight. Moss stepped onto his friend's broad back, his claws gripping Bram's thick fur for balance, climbed onto the chair with effort but also with pride, and kept the full dignity of a cat, not the helplessness of a patient. He settled into the cushion with a long sigh and began to purr, a sound like a small motor running. The early suspicion slowly melted away after snowstorm nights, when two unfamiliar breaths kept finding each other to share warmth. From that day on, Bram did not leave. Winter continued its hold on the valley. The snow did not melt. More fell every few days, adding to the already impressive depths. Mr. Thorne had to shovel a path from the door to the woodshed every morning. He became the eyes, the ears, and the legs for Moss. as Moss began to lose more of his sight and hearing, the world becoming dimmer and quieter with each passing week. Thorne took a small bell that had belonged to the first cat he owned 40 years ago and fastened it to Bram's neck. Hoping the sound would help Moss locate his friend, the bell was brass, tarnished green in spots from age but still clear in tone. The leather strap was soft with years of use, worn smooth and supple, for a predator like Bram. That jingling was a disaster at first. He still stalked forest mice beneath the pines when his wound healed enough to allow him outside, his body moving with the silence that came from generations of hunters before him. Every movement was calculated, every step placed with precision. But the bell betrayed him again and again, sending every small animal scattering long before he could crouch low and strike. The mice would freeze at the first faint jingle, their tiny ears picking up the sound from yards away, then disappear into their holes under the snow. The rabbits would bolt, white tails flashing as they zigzagged through the trees. The squirrels would climb, racing up trunk after trunk until they were safe in the highest branches. There were days Bram returned in with an empty belly and a foul temper, claws shredding the tree trunks around the house to vent his anger at the nuisance of the leather strap. Long gouges appeared in the bark of the old ponderosa pine near the porch. Wood chips scattered on the ground below. His ears stayed flat against his head, his tail lashing back and forth like a whip. But little by little, over weeks and then months, he learned to control every muscle so he could walk without making the bell ring while hunting. He discovered that perfect stillness kept the clapper from moving. He learned to place each paw with such precision that his body never swayed enough to cause a chime. He would freeze between steps, holding each position for long seconds before moving again. In the forest, he became a ghost again, silent as falling snow. Then, approaching the cabin after a hunt, he would shake his head deliberately and the bell would announce him, the bright chiming carrying across the clearing. He realized that whenever the bell chimed, Moss stopped drifting, lost inside his dim, clouded darkness. The old cat's ears would perk up, rotating toward the sound. His head would lift from wherever he had been dozing. A look of relief would cross his face, the worry lines around his eyes smoothing out. Bram did not abandon his instincts. Instead, he learned to make peace with the inconvenience of the bell in exchange for Moss's ease inside the wooden cabin. Feet that had once moved like a ghost now sometimes chose to create a steady jingle, just to make sure his aging companion always knew the way home, knew that he had not been abandoned. Bram also learned how to open the door. The mechanism was simple for a human, just a lever handle that moved down. But for a creature without opposable thumbs, it required innovation and determination. Every morning, Moss sat waiting by the porch door. His routine never changed. He would wake with the first light, stretch as much as his stiff joints allowed, his back arching and his tail pointing straight up, then shuffle to the door and sit facing it. He never meowed or called out. He simply waited with the patience of the very old. Bram braced both front paws against the handle and pressed down. His weight shifted forward onto his hind legs. The metal lever moved under the pressure of his paws. The latch clicked, a sound Bram learned to listen for. The door cracked open, sunlight pouring in if it was a clear day, or cold air in the scent of more snow if clouds covered the sky. Moss stepped outside carefully, feeling his way across the boards, and sat in his old spot, a flat stone near the edge of the porch that held the sun's warmth during the day and released it slowly. Bram did not go anywhere, only stood beside him like a shadow, his larger body a constant presence. His eyes scanned the tree line constantly, never resting, always watching. His ears rotated like radar dishes, catching every sound from the creak of branches to the scurry of small animals in the underbrush. Then winter arrived for real, as if everything before had been just practice. January came with temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks, the kind of cold that made the trees crack and split in the night. Sharp sounds like gunshots that would wake Mr. Thorne from sleep, the kind of cold that froze your breath before it left your mouth. One day, Moss ran a fever and collapsed. He had been walking across the kitchen floor, heading toward his water bowl, when his legs simply gave out. He fell onto his side, breathing hard, his sides heaving. His body shook with chills despite the fire burning hot just feet away. Mr. Thorne wrapped him in blankets, layer after layer of soft fabric, and tried to get water into him with an eyedropper. But Moss could barely swallow. The water dribbled out the sides of his mouth. His eyes stayed closed. His breathing grew shallow. The next morning, Mr. Thorne found a pure white owl feather placed neatly beside Moss. Not an accident, not a coincidence blown in by the wind. It was a gift Bram had brought back from the forest. The feather was perfect, each barb intact, zipping together smoothly. No blood on it, no damage to its structure. Bram had carried it gently in his teeth, holding it just right so his fangs would not pierce the delicate veins. Each day after that, another feather appeared, sometimes owl feathers, white as fresh snow, sometimes hawk feathers, brown and barred with darker stripes. Once a blue jay feather that was bright even in the dim cabin light, a startling splash of blue against the worn floorboards. They were like a quiet callback to life, evidence that the world outside still existed, still turned, still held beauty, and was waiting for Moss to rejoin it when he was ready. When the snow began to melt, the first early spring sunbeams broke through the gray clouds that had covered the sky for months. March had arrived, but winter fought back hard, refusing to surrender its hold. Wind from the mountain peaks still carried the bite of thawing ice and blew hard onto the porch in gusts that came in waves. The gusts came in waves, rattling the windows in their frames, making the whole cabin creak. Moss strained his dry nose to breathe in the scent of wet earth and new buds stirring somewhere beneath the remaining snow. But the strong gusts made the old cat shiver, eyes squeezed shut from exhaustion. His cream fur rippled and flattened against his thin body with each blast of wind. You could see his ribs through his coat now. He had lost so much weight. Right then, Bram stepped forward one pace, placing himself between Moss and the wind. The bobcat fluffed up his thick gray fur until he looked twice his normal size and stood firm like a living wall, blocking every cold stream of air rushing toward the porch. His body absorbed the wind's force, taking the punishment so Moss would not have to, in Bram's sheltering shadow. Moss's world became warm and quiet. The old cat let out a small breath of relief, a sound barely louder than a whisper, and calmly tasted the breath of spring without having to fight the forest's harshness. His whiskers stopped trembling. His body relaxed muscle by muscle. He sat there for an hour, just breathing, just being, while Bram stood guard. Once, Mr. Thorne was gone for a few days, traveling down to town for supplies that the cabin desperately needed. Flour and sugar and coffee, kerosene for the lamps, medicine for Moss. The spring thaw had turned the mountain roads to mud, and his old truck got stuck twice. Once so badly he had to walk 3 miles to a neighboring ranch to borrow a tractor to pull him out. What should have been one day became 3. When he returned, exhausted and covered in mud, he found the notebook he had forgotten on the windowsill blown open by the wind. The window had a gap where the wood had warped over the years, letting in drafts and occasionally blowing loose papers around. But the blank page held more than his handwriting. A bobcat paw print, pressed in dried mud, was stamped clearly across a line he had written on a hopeless night weeks earlier. "I'm afraid Moss will be lonely when the storm comes." Bram's paw print overlapped it perfectly, like a silent but ironclad promise. Every toe was visible in the dried mud. Every claw mark showed clearly. The mud had dried into a permanent record, as solid as any signature. Mr. Thorne stood stunned, his hands shaking as he picked up the notebook and held it closer to the lamp. Bram was not only protecting Moss's body, he was soothing an old man's fear, too, telling him in the only way a wild animal could that Moss would never be alone. Their friendship continued like that through the slow turning of seasons. Every night, Bram lay between the door and Moss when the fireplace burned low and the cabin grew cold. His position never varied. He placed himself where any threat would have to go through him first, his body a barrier between danger and the creature he protected. One day, Moss no longer had the strength to scratch the back of his neck, where the fur had begun to thin and the skin underneath had grown dry and itchy. The skin there was irritated. Flaking, Moss twisted his head, trying to reach it with his hind leg, straining until he nearly fell over. His leg trembled with effort but would not cooperate. It trembled and fell back down uselessly. Moss let out a small cry of frustration, a sound that broke Mr. Thorne's heart to hear. Bram quietly approached, his movements slow and gentle, and used his rough, strong tongue to groom Moss, strand by strand, in the right place with the right pressure. His tongue moved in steady strokes, patient and thorough. He licked until the skin was clean and the itch was gone, until Moss stopped squirming. Moss lifted his neck to give Bram better access and purred steadily like a smooth-running engine, feeling the clumsy care that was still deeply sincere. His eyes closed in bliss. His whole body went soft and relaxed. When Bram finished, he licked Moss's ear once, then settled down beside him. One spring night, in all that peace they had built together, while everyone slept deeply, a stray ember popped from the fireplace and silently caught an old pile of newspapers Mr. Thorne had stacked beside the hearth, then spread quickly to the braided rug. The paper curled and blackened at the edges first, then burst into eager flames. Fire spread quickly to the rug, hungry tongues of orange and red licking across the braided fabric that had been there for decades. Smoke thickened, rising in gray clouds that filled the room and spread through the cabin like a living thing, searching every corner in the choking darkness. Moss could only curl in on himself, panicking because he could not see an exit. His blindness, which he had learned to live with in the safety of familiar spaces, became a terror in chaos. He cried out, a thin wail of pure fear. The instinctive terror of fire made Bram thrash and surge, frantic for escape. Every wild instinct screamed at him to run, to save himself, to leave the burning den. He charged the main window, the bell on his neck clanging and sharp. Rapid bursts as he repeatedly hurled himself against the glass to find a way out. His shoulder hit hard enough to rattle the frame. The glass shook but held, stronger than it looked. He hit again, harder, again. The bell rang with each impact, a frantic alarm that carried into the night. By luck, an electrician from town was driving home after repairing a broken line at the far end of the valley. He had been up on a pole for hours in the cold, fixing damaged wires. His pickup headlights swept across the cabin just as black smoke began to curl from the door cracks, visible even in the darkness against the white paint of the doorframe. Seeing the silhouette of a large animal roaring and lashing at the window in flickering firelight, the electrician stopped immediately, his truck skidding slightly on the gravel road. He grabbed a metal shovel from his truck bed, but stayed cautious and did not dare move too close. He had lived in Montana his whole life, long enough to know better than to approach a wild animal, especially one that was clearly panicked. It was the strange jingling bell, ringing in rhythm with each impact, that made him realize something was wrong. Wild animals did not wear bells. Someone's pet was trapped. He ran forward, boots crunching on old snow, and used the shovel to smash the window open and free the animal. Glass exploded inward, tinkling as it hit the floor. Bram shot outside like he had been fired from a cannon, leaped onto a nearby rock, breath ragged and fast. His sides heaved like bellows. His eyes were wild with panic, pupils dilated huge and black. Only then did the electrician hear Mr. Thorne coughing and a weak cat cry behind the smoke. He rushed in, covering his mouth and nose with his sleeve, found the fire extinguisher mounted by the door where it had hung for 20 years, and used it to knock down flames that had started licking the ceiling. White foam covered the burning rug, smothering the fire. The flames hissed and died, leaving only smoke and the acrid smell of burned fabric. He found Mr. Thorne collapsed near the back bedroom, overcome by smoke, and helped the old man out onto the porch. Mr. Thorne was coughing hard, deep, racking coughs that shook his whole body. His face was covered in soot, his eyes streaming tears. He clutched Moss against his chest with both arms. The cabin was only smoke damaged, with one corner of the doorway scorched black. The walls were covered in soot but still standing. The damage was bad, but not catastrophic. But as Mr. Thorne watched Bram standing motionless in the mud 20 feet away, still shaking, still wild-eyed, he understood that Bram's frantic pounding and desperate escape effort had, by accident, saved all their lives. The bell that had cost Bram so many meals had brought help when it mattered most. That same spring, as the world warmed and came back to life, the call of a female bobcat echoed from deep in the forest. The sound came at night, a yowling cry that carried for miles across the valley. It was the sound of a female in heat, looking for a mate, calling out her readiness. Bram stood on the threshold of the cabin door, his body tense. Wilderness freedom on one side, the chance to mate and continue his bloodline and return to the life he was born for. Moss lying weakly on the other side, growing older and frailer with each passing day, needing protection now more than ever. The call came again, closer this time, more insistent. Bram's muscles tensed with the urge to answer. His tail twitched. But then he looked back at Moss, at the cream-colored cat sleeping peacefully by the fire, trusting completely in Bram's protection. He turned back, pushed the door closed with a paw, using the same motion he had learned for opening it, and chose to stay beside the aging cat's bed instead of returning to the deep woods. The calls continued for 3 more nights, echoing through the pines, then faded as the female moved on to find another mate. Time, harsh and relentless, carried them into later years. Seasons blurred together. Another summer brought heat, another autumn brought color, another winter brought snow. But through it all, Bram stayed when wolf eyes began to circle the cabin more often, appearing at dusk like gray ghosts between the trees. Bram realized that if he stayed inside as a bell-wearing pet, he could not protect Moss from hungry wolves. The walls would trap him, limit his ability to maneuver and fight. The bell would give away his position, announce his every movement to enemies who hunted by sound as much as sight. He needed to be outside, free to move and fight on his own terms, to use the terrain and his knowledge of the forest. He licked Moss's forehead gently, a feline kiss in place of goodbye. His rough tongue rasped over the cream fur between the old cat's ears, lingering there for a long moment. As he stepped down from the porch, moving toward his new life as guardian from the shadows, the bell strap caught on a rusty nail that protruded from the doorframe. The old nail stuck out from where the wood had split over the winter, a piece of metal that had been there so long Mr. Thorne had stopped noticing it. The bobcat stopped short, the leather pulled tight against his neck, jerking him backward. He looked at the bell hanging from his throat, then at Moss, drowsing in a patch of afternoon sunlight that fell through the window. The old cat's sides rose and fell peacefully, unaware. With a slow motion, patient and deliberate, Bram backed up and carefully slipped his head free of the leather strap. Leaving the bell lying silent right beside the foot of Moss's bed, he ducked his head, tucking his chin to his chest. The strap slid over his ears with a whisper of leather on fur. It fell to the wooden floor with a soft sound, barely audible. He took off the warmth and companionship of the cabin to return to the forest, to build a defensive perimeter from afar, to protect from the shadows the way his kind was meant to. Bram walked down the porch steps and into the yard, his mottled gray shape fading into the vast wilderness. His paws made no sound on the soft earth and old pine needles. Within moments, he was invisible among the pines, as if he had never been there at all. Mr. Thorne stood behind the door and witnessed the moment their visible tether was removed. But he did not feel grief. He realized Bram had completed his journey from wild animal to friend to guardian. Bram returned silence to himself, the silence that was his birthright as a predator, but left sound behind for Moss, the sound that had become a lifeline. Moss did not call out when he woke from his nap and searched with his nose and ears for his friend. The old cat lifted his head, sniffing the air. He understood, in the way animals understand things beyond words, that Bram's departure was not abandonment. Whenever the spring wind blew across the porch, the bell, lying on the wooden ledge where Bram had left it, would chime once with a familiar little jingle. The wind would catch it just right, and the clapper would swing against the brass. Moss would twitch his ears forward, lift his head slightly, rest his cream chin against the old leather strap that still held the lingering scent and warmth of the forest, of Bram's fur, and drift into the most peaceful sleep he had ever known. He did not need to see. He knew his great guardian was still out there, among the pines, keeping his world quiet and safe. From then on, each morning brought another feather, sometimes owl feathers, white and ghostly, soft as clouds, sometimes crow feathers, black and sleek, catching the light with purple iridescence. Sometimes a small stone, smooth from years in the creek, cool and perfect in its roundness. Moss touched each gift with his nose, his whiskers brushing over the surfaces to read textures his failing eyes could no longer see. Then he would lay beside it as if guarding something sacred, his body curled around the gift protectively, one paw extended to touch it. And every full moon, if you looked up toward the hilltop where the oldest pines grew, you could see a bobcat silhouette still as a statue, upright, regal, no growl, no movement, only watching, only guarding. The moonlight would turn his eyes to burning gold, 2 points of fire in the darkness. His ears would rotate slowly, listening to everything, the rustle of mice, the movement of deer, the approach of anything that might threaten what he protected. But his body stayed perfectly still, a sentinel carved from shadow and starlight. No one ever said goodbye, because between souls that truly belong, goodbye is never necessary. Bram left behind the silence of a predator to wear a bell for his friend, and it turned out the strongest instinct was not survival, but protection. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.